Got our Matt Duffler stand-in. So my name is Dave Stenglein from Kenzan, and we're here to talk about extending Spinnaker. So we'll go down the line here and ask everyone to introduce themselves. We will introduce themselves first and then come back again from the end of the line and talk about how you've extended Spinnaker.
My name is Tomas. I work in the Spinnaker team. I have the original first edition Spinnaker t-shirt.
That's the highlight.
Yeah, top that, Lars.
My name's Lars. I work at the Spinnaker team at Google. I only have one Spinnaker shirt. Tomas has many.
I'm John. I work at Target. I have an official Target shirt.
I'm Adam. Been on the Spinnaker team for almost 3 years. I probably have as many t-shirts as Tomas.
I'm Robert Farr. I work at Cerner, and we've been working with Spinnaker for about 9 months now.
Hi, I'm Owen. I'm from Oracle, and I guess we were involved in contributing a cloud provider to Spinnaker. So we're interested in how we can integrate various other services into Spinnaker.
How's your t-shirt game?
So you mentioned that you've done a cloud provider.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, or?
Yeah, sure. So we started last year, and the goal there was to integrate a new cloud provider for a totally new cloud that we'd built. We had a couple of issues, I guess. So we were a fairly small team, and obviously Spinnaker's a huge project. So we learned quite a lot pretty quick, but the initial experience of contributing a cloud provider was reasonably difficult. I guess we could have done with more documentation, and but in the end, I think we got there. So yeah.
Won't you we'll just have everyone go back down the line and say what they've done for extending.
All right. So at Cerner, we about 9 months ago, we used DCOS. So we actually contributed a cloud provider for DCOS. And then we've kind of started on our journey of doing additional extensions, Echo to Splunk integration, and Spinnaker monitoring to StatsD is a couple that we plan on open sourcing.
I probably worked on most aspects of the backend services, so lots of cloud driver work, lots of contributions to the AWS implementation, not so much to our Titus implementation, but I was probably responsible for the first extension point. I think it was Front 50 back in the day. That kind of set us on the path of being able to build our own Netflix-specific extensions, code extensions that live in our own repositories. So I'm quite familiar with that and happy to hear ideas for other extension points.
So I was hired at Target about 1.5 years ago, and my first project was we use OpenStack, we use Spinnaker, so create the provider for it. We worked with Veritas. Emily, who now works at Netflix, was working on this as well from the Veritas side.
I worked on the original Kubernetes provider. I'm working on the next iteration of it too. I did a lot of work on Halyard. Most of the work carried itself through all the various Spinnaker subcomponents, but I always contributed to the Spinnaker proper repos. I have never done the modular Spinnaker builds.
Adam forgot to mention that he did all the tagging support into Elasticsearch too. So if you have any really hard questions around that, he's the person to ask. I wrote Echo and Igor, and Guard worked with us adding Travis CI integration. Chris, I think, added the integration into Slack, but a lot of that was built on kind of all these site frameworks. And then currently I'm working on the Titus cloud provider, and a lot of that work was really done around the stuff that Lars did around kind of indexing Docker registries and triggering things out of the Docker registries. So there are quite a lot of extension points in Spinnaker and besides the cloud provider.
So probably the first question for the panel is, what recommendations do you have for first-time extenders?
I would join the dev channel on the Spinnaker Slack. I think there's a lot of people there who are happy to see new contributors and are happy to help you along. It's not easy to get Spinnaker up and running in a dev environment. Everyone has a different best practice. Maybe we can all talk about how we do that, but definitely reach out to the dev channel, see if someone's doing what you're trying to do, or if it's something that you should maybe write a proposal for. But I think the community is generally pretty welcoming to changes.
Along with that, I'd say definitely reach out and say what you want to work on first. Because the core contributors will definitely give guidance on, the right path to go down and where to actually find the hooks within all the different pieces are. Because if you don't know the layout of the projects, you might not find what you need, at least easily. And also small, concise commits.
I'd like to add that it's worth kind of figuring out what your deploy story is. If you're going to do a private org-specific extension, figure out how you're going to actually deploy that, whether you're going to do your own packages like we do, or whether you're going to do Halyard with a custom bomb. Kind of figure that out and probably do some test runs just to see, is that going to work for you? It's going to allow for a much more rapid iteration cycle rather than leaving that to the very end and trying to figure out how am I going to deploy this to one of my test environments. We kind of figured that out very early on. So when we do an extension, the idea is, well, where in the code, is there an open extension point there right now? If not, okay, let's see what the actual codified interface looks like. And then from that point on, we're going to do it private. And if it works out all right, we'll probably consider moving it forward. And I think if you try to do that in a different direction, you might get hung up.
I think for us, a big part of it was, first, reach out, but also just take some time to look at the code. It's one of the great advantages of open source is the code is there for you to look at, read, and attempt to understand how a various service is working, and what the parts are. So we spent a lot of time doing that just to get our head wrapped around some of the services and how they work before we really started thinking about extension.
Yeah, and from our point of view, one of the nice things about Spinnaker is actually the consistency of the other cloud providers. So you can pretty much dive into the code base and you can kind of go back in the Git history. You can see how people have contributed a cloud provider. So that's something we definitely did. We went back and reviewed some of the other cloud providers and see how they contributed to the project. And that was really useful for us. And I think now a lot of the cloud providers are pretty consistent. You can pretty much almost verbatim follow the patterns that other cloud providers have implemented.
My advice would be figure out what you're building. So if it's a custom notification, then that goes into Echo. So if you're integrating with a continuous delivery tool, that goes into Igor. So figure out what you're building, figure out where it sits, and then start from there. So there's a pretty precise map of where things fit. And if you have a good idea, like if you're writing your own custom expression, figure out where that sits. And if you don't know where it sits, then ask the question, and then we'll point you to where it sits. And that'll make your life a lot easier than trying to shove something where it doesn't belong.
So kind of building on that, Spinnaker is a pretty flexible system. It can do a lot sort of out of the box. When, other than say a new cloud driver or something like that, when are the times when you actually need to extend? How do you make that decision?
I think one big extension point potentially would be custom Orca stages. If people want new pipeline stages that maybe they can't open source or something that Spinnaker doesn't do well enough in a first-class fashion, looking into Orca, and there's actually a really good write-up written by, I think, one of the chaos engineering guys on the Spinnaker IO doc site that shows you exactly what you have to do in Orca. It's pretty self-contained, how to add a stage, and then how to make the corresponding changes, I think, in deck to make sure that you can actually add this new kind of stage doing pretty much anything you can imagine directly in Spinnaker.
It seems like there's quite a few examples from Netflix that we've seen over the last 2 days. You guys have your own modules, you have your own deck deck modules, deck views, etc. So if we could kind of open those up to the community and see some examples, that would be really, really helpful. But yeah, there's definitely some examples I've seen in the last 2 days where you build your own modules. I think that's a pattern that we'd be very interested in understanding more about.
Yeah, I think that's the pattern that's worked quite well for us. I don't know, a lot of the reasons why those things are internal is because they're integrations with other services that aren't yet open source. But we're more than happy to talk about and provide feedback on a lot of those. We've got some cloud driver experiences that are kind of driven by our cloud security. So they're asking us to do stuff around deploys, which is a logical point to have an extension in place. On the stage generation front, we've actually got plans to kind of allow you to codify in configuration basically webhook stages. So to treat them as more first-class stages, but backed by configuration. Because we've seen a lot of examples where people are adding stages that just kind of talk to external services that maybe their team has written, and to kind of lower the barrier to actually having to add functionality to Spinnaker, perhaps to the point where you just need to modify configuration rather than actually commit code to Orca. That would probably make some of the other teams at Netflix's experience adding stages much simpler. We wanted to do that this quarter, not going to happen, but that's something on our more immediate radar.
So do you mean that eventually people need to write less and less code effectively to extend Spinnaker?
Depending on the type of extension, yes. We don't really want, certainly other teams at Netflix, we don't want them to have to become experts in Spinnaker. We want them to just be able to provide the minimal amount of glue code that builds upon the existing Spinnaker constructs to make their stuff work. And a lot of times these guys that are doing, guys or gals that are doing integrations with Spinnaker might not be JVM developers. There's a lot of teams at Netflix that are JavaScript developers, for example, and there's a big impedance mismatch between having these people come and try and build something in Spinnaker. It's not a good fit.
Yeah, I would say, we spent a lot of time early on trying to avoid it. So, we looked first, can we configure it? Second, can we use something like an extension point like Jenkins, Job, or the webhooks? But when we get to the point where we start feeling like it's starting to look like duct tape and baling wire to put something together, that's kind of a litmus test for us to start talking about doing the work to do the extension. Again, we're kind of early on in that process, so I think as we do more of it, we may go quicker to that, just to keep things clean, but that's kind of the approach we've taken so far.
I think it's worth noting maybe like the usability aspect of this, right? So a lot of times it's more convenient for you to just write the UI for a custom stage, even though it backs up to the same underlying construct in Spinnaker. So for the bake stage that we have in Netflix, for example, we have a Titus-based bake stage and AWS bake stage, but the only thing that is different between the two of them is the UI. So sometimes it's worth it just taking, like I can run this as a webhook stage, but then building like a very light interface that maps more towards your own purpose and see how far you can take that, whether it's even just running a Jenkins job under the hood. So if you look at the run script stage that we have in Spinnaker, like that's really the same thing as running a Jenkins stage, but there's business context to that stage. Like it exists because it makes that stage kind of easier for some people to use, and just start with that, right? Like start with how do I plug this into my pipeline at the UI level and see how far you can push that before you actually start writing any code, customizing at the Orca and maybe lower levels or even writing on the surface.
One of our original visions for extensions that kind of 2 years ago when we were talking to different groups was that if you wanted to extend Spinnaker, you'd need to make changes at the UI and at the bottom of the stack in Cloud Driver, and everything should just kind of pass through the middle. We're not quite there right now. A lot of extensions kind of do touch on Orca, but longer term, it'd be great if we could just remove a lot of changes from Orca that are probably unnecessary. Most of Orca operates in the function of fire off a request, runs asynchronously, a process monitors that for completion or failure, and then moves on to the next. pretty much every single operation works like that. So we should be able to generify it such that people can configure their way into that rather than code their way into that.
It might be nice to think about the extensions also from the perspective of third-party systems integrating with Spinnaker. So for example, if someone has a suite of Jenkins tools, for example, that interface really well with Spinnaker, or Travis tools that make it easier to pass artifacts into Spinnaker, and adding that to the broader open source ecosystem of Spinnaker, and starting to build like a third-party plugin system in a sense. Part of the stuff we're doing with the artifact handling should ideally make that easier to have a well-defined API saying, this is how you trigger pipelines, this is how you retrieve information from pipelines. All of this follows a well-defined model. Should ideally foster contributions to Spinnaker that don't necessarily have to touch the Spinnaker code base itself.
So, Adam, you mentioned sort of the ways you sometimes come across places that need extension points. Are there any other places that people find are missing good extension points, like Breakout or anything like that?
Yeah, the naming convention, we've heard that for years. I think Lars can probably best comment on kind of some of the thoughts and directions that they're talking about. But yeah, for naming conventions, like being able to make that pluggable off of Frigga, especially for organizations that come to Spinnaker with already established footprints that don't really fit the application stack detail model.
Yeah, I talked about this briefly yesterday in the context of the Kubernetes provider, but in order to make it work, we need another way to derive the information that Frigga gives us from something that might not necessarily be a name, or maybe it's a name but it relies on some different convention for relaying those kinds of relationships. And the approach we're taking is we're soon open sourcing this Spinnaker subcomponent called Moniker, which allows you to pass in maybe like a server group or like a load balancer for a certain provider, and from that, based on your custom code, which you can provide externally or contribute back to Spinnaker, and have that say like, hey, this is the application this belongs to, and this is the stack and the detail of it, which all could come from things like annotations inside the object, or again, a different kind of naming convention.
Another source that I've seen recently is the ability to come in and plug in your external health providers. So if you're contributing to, let's say, console, it feels like right now in Spinnaker there's a lot of reliance on Eureka and console, but it's kind of all done differently. And in the ideal world, there will be a unified way of providing health for the different cloud providers so it can be reusable. I feel like there's a gap there that would make a lot of the constructs in Spinnaker, such as red-black pushes, rolling red blacks, a lot more usable if it was a lot easier to plug in, let's say, whatever metric store I have with health.
I know a couple places that we've run into problems is authentication. Especially I know Edwin's team right now is working on trying to parse out the roles from X509 certificates. And he should be close to getting that pushed upstream.
Finishing the halyard portion of it.
And on top of that, also I know that, that is sort of extendable. It'd be nice if it was a little less code to extend it and say, like, I want this part of the certificate, more configuration. On top of that, we've also run into a problem with how Spinnaker parses RPM names and deb file names. We ran into a major bug which isn't easily fixed because we don't follow normal naming conventions on those within Target. And I don't know, after, was it Cameron who gave that talk earlier on extending? I got some ideas from that on what we can do. So we can actually do that on our own and not try and push our conventions onto the community. Or bad conventions. I'm sure there's more. Oh, extending how to run Packer too is it's a little clunky.
Mr. Handlebars isn't here to speak for himself, so.
with the RPM parsing in Orca, I think this is the point of artifact decoration, that this logic is moved to the producers of the artifacts. And I think this should be solved at that level because Orca shouldn't need to know the details about RPMs or Debian packages. Yeah, so at least be able to override it with decorated artifacts.
It's actually not on that. It's on Packer in Roscoe. When you bake an image, we generate a unique key so that if another bake request comes in at the same time for the same version of the thing, it like just kind of silently ignores that other one because there's a current bake request going on. But if you mess that up, all of a sudden, every package that comes in that they're all different RPMs, like not even the same app, and they resolved to the same key. And now you've just released, you know, 2 different apps think they're the same. And which, luckily we didn't hit that problem, but there was a possibility of it.
I'm not sure if everyone here is aware of the effort that Lars is talking about, but it's really around the standardization of here's a source that talks to Spinnaker, and here's a series of artifacts that then are kind of provided by this source, and then having the ability to flow these artifacts through or across the entire pipeline. I think this effort is quite interesting because one of the things that happens, for example, I sat through the Target talk yesterday, and they said they had a plugin for Drone IO, for example. We run into issues right now where polling our Docker registry, polling our Jenkins registry just creates a lot of noise that might not be the best pattern. And I think one of the points of extending that with either existing CI systems or even things like Artifactory is to allow the ability for them to do a push and say, an event happened in wherever, but here's the artifact that was resulted. So I think once we standardize that format, it'll be a lot simpler to then integrate your TimCD, your different sorts of CI truths. So it is a pain point that hopefully will get better, but just wanted to point out that effort.
One of the things we were particularly interested in is extending Spinnaker for our own internal use cases. And I think when writing the cloud provider, we were really aware that we were kind of muddying the code base. So I guess that's something we've discussed before, whether we can pull some of the integrations out into separate modules. I guess that's something that maybe we need to think about. Yeah, I think we contributed some libraries which may have conflicted with your libraries, and we're very aware that any contributions we make going ahead, if we want to do some really tight integrations, we don't want to muddy up the Spinnaker code base. We don't want to affect Netflix in any way. So that's definitely something that we're very aware of. And I guess it would be something we should think about over the next year. As we grow and there's more and more cloud providers, it becomes harder and harder to maintain that code.
Yeah, I would suspect at some point we'll need to undergo an effort to kind of split apart CloudDriver. We've kind of put it off because it's a large amount of effort, and it kind of makes it more difficult to do certain things. But we're skirting a fine line of 6 or 7 different cloud providers with their own dependencies. At some point, they're going to step on each other. We dodged the bullet with some retrofit dependencies, but we're going to hit that sometime. It's just a ticking time bomb. But I don't know what the final solution would be. But it might lead us down a path of being able to put some tighter controls and interfaces around how a cloud provider should interact with the rest of the system, and maybe have a TCK in there so that cloud providers can kind of validate them against the assumptions of Spinnaker. So it's not all doom and gloom. If we do this effort, we might come out better on the other side, but it's a large amount of effort and not something we've been chomping at the bit on the Netflix side, but we might get forced into it over the next couple of quarters.
One of the best ways we found to integrate is kind of the API level. So extending things like Kubernetes is very easy because it's all API based. So if there's a way that we could hook in via the API, it makes life a lot easier.
Certainly.
Yeah, I would add to that. In general, if you're extending any of the projects, in so much as you can avoid bringing in external libraries, it's to your advantage because you're sharing a single class path. And so that's one of the things we do look at is we when we do that extension, we're looking at API level calls and reusing the existing libraries that we already have at our fingertips.
The one thing to keep in mind, though, is as part of the separation effort in CloudDriver, we now have, I think, 2 cloud providers that depend on the AWS cloud provider, the tightest one for sure, and I think the easiest one as well. So there's a little bit more kind of juggling there that needs to happen to figure out. And I'm not quite sure how all the good old App Engine and Google and GKE, GWE, GH.
G something, yeah. I think App Engine and Google don't share much code, but they might. I'm not the right person to ask for that, actually. I'm sorry. The thing that I guess with tearing apart CloudDriver makes me worried is that it's a lot more overhead and complexity right now. If any of you have released a subcomponent of Spinnaker and then tried to use it in another subcomponent, you've gone through that Spinnaker dependencies library. One of the problems there is that sometimes if something goes wrong, you have to track down and say like, okay, so I released Spinnaker dependencies at this version, that means this subcomponent was at that version, which means that when that was released, this was at another version, which actually pulled in a different version of Spinnaker dependencies, and you start to walk down this path, and then you, at the end, are left in a fairly convoluted state with respect to what's actually running and what libraries you've imported. So I guess there's a reason to pull apart CloudDriver, but I guess my fear is that it adds more trouble than it's worth.
I think one idea for pulling it apart would be to not rely on shared libraries and actually introduce some kind of a more network boundary before that, and let the individual blasted apart bits do all their business. Maybe they don't use Redis to cache, maybe they don't need to cache, but it opens up some flexibility there. But yeah, I do echo the concerns with certainly shared libraries and the pains we have right now with pushing updates across all the 7 or 8 services that we have right now.
Thanks. So going back to custom pipeline stages, so what are your thoughts and experiences with the webhook driver? I took a little bit of a look at that, and it's missing a few key features. One is the ability to get some kind of logs out of it, as well as parameters out of it. Any thoughts on that, and how widely is this thing actually used?
You can add parameters by expressions. You can add anything by expressions, but then now you have 2 problems. So
I meant the other way, pulling stuff out. Right? I know you can feed parameters in, but it doesn't seem to have any way of getting parameter results out, or some kind of logging, build logs or operational logs out of it. It's like it's a 1-bit output, pass or fail.
The Shipstead team created the webhook stage, and I was not deeply involved, but one of the requirements was that the payload you got back from the webhook stage should be able to give you links and stuff like that, so I'm pretty sure it's in there. Yeah.
Just not discoverable.
Yeah, it's by reading the source, I guess.
I'll ping you on Slack.
Okay.
That does bring up one important thing with contributing upstream to this. You should be contributing good documentation with that as well. Reading the source isn't always the best solution.
I think we all can get better at that.
But we're agile.
I agree.
There was a question in the middle towards the back. That's better.
Nice.
Almost.
Very nice spiral there. My question relates to the library, shared library dependency issues that you run into. And the question is basically, why not do a monorepo approach to this? And since we're doing sort of clean-cut releases for all the services, at Chartboost we have a suite of Scala microservices that use a monorepo. They share a bunch of code, but they build a bunch of separate services that are run separately. And it works very well for us to avoid these dependency issues. Has there been any thought given to that?
interesting idea. I don't think we're necessarily against it, but I don't think we've given it a tremendous amount of thought. Some people on this panel come from organizations that are very pro monorepo and have a lot of tooling available to support that, and some companies don't have a lot of tooling set up for monorepos. Netflix and Google are at kind of opposite ends of that spectrum. Yes, if push comes to shove and we feel a lot of pain, and that's something that would almost instantly alleviate that pain without a lot of other problems, we could consider it. In the back there.
I'm a bad receiver. Need to work on my hand skill. I've learned of a roadmap item regarding a native CI capability offered within Spinnaker. Is there any kind of documentations or at least some level of awareness of where that journey is going?
I mean, that's something we've been kind of toying around with here at Netflix. I'm not quite sure where it sits on the roadmap, or most likely it's changed. Internally, we've kind of shifted focus a little bit. We realize here at Netflix we've got a tremendous amount of Jenkins usage. Some of the SLAs around Jenkins are a little bit different than Spinnaker. We've got support for running containers. And part of the thought is there an opportunity to replace some of that Jenkins load with stuff running in containers and do a better job of kind of orchestrating and managing and exposing that in Spinnaker? So I think there's been a bit of movement on the Netflix side around kind of CI, but very immature right now, and I wouldn't expect it for the next couple of quarters at least.
Yeah, we do want to improve the run job stage, which Adam alluded to, where at the very least you should be able to, in Kubernetes, access the logs that your container produced and have some better ability to troubleshoot and see what went right or wrong inside of your CI job. But like Adam said, that's a few quarters down the road probably.
Okay, so if I can add further to that question, that improvement to the CI integration, right now, if you want to look at the details of what the job has executed, you have to really click on the link, and it takes you to the Jenkins server, and you possibly log in, and you have to dig into the build log. I've actually done some customization I would like to contribute, but the idea is to be able to fetch the build log and make that so like within the view of the pipeline itself without externalizing the call. Is that something that you guys already worked on, or are you seeking?
You said you have pull requests coming in?
I am going to do that.
I think that's something that we would totally be open to, because yeah, you're right. Right now, you click on that link and you get sent to probably an ugly Jenkins UI, and you get to view that nice build log. It would be great if that was a little bit more embedded in the UI, kind of more contextual next to the thing that actually ran it. You could more easily see the parameters that went in, and all the bits and pieces should be there. Igor already has access to the Jenkins that ran it, so you could probably just stream that right back out to the UI. So we'd love that.
Is there any further thought process as far as, since Jenkins is your big enabler for the backend in terms of CI, the thought process of making it more of a first-class citizen, especially if it's a Jenkins 2 implementation, whereby Jenkins 2 has its offering of a pipeline concept, be able to supposedly bring the visualization, the annotation of such pipeline into the view of what a Spinnaker pipeline would represent, such, rather than just that single dot.
I think it's something that perhaps like at the Netflix level, we don't engage with that much, because Jenkins pipelines are not used as extensively here for that integration. But you know, like if you have a way of kind of pulling in the information from a Jenkins 2 pipeline and being able to visualize that within the Spinnaker pipeline, we'll be happy to help you like figure that out and put that together. On this discussion as well, one of the things that we talk about is also surfacing test results. So being able to like not have to go in and look at the run job stage or look at the Jenkins stage to see, you know, which tests fail when they fail and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's definitely areas that can be improved in Spinnaker. And if, you if you guys have an interest in contributing this, I'd be more than happy to like point you to the right areas. There are a few like very low-hanging fruits in that integration as well. Like for the longest time, you have to turn off, I think it's like cross-site scripting authentication. And that really is just somebody coming in and adding an interceptor to say, hey, get this token and send it along. And we haven't done it because, like from the Jenkins perspective, you just flip that switch and never touch it again. But everybody that wants to get started with Spinnaker runs into this issue of, I can't talk to Jenkins, why? And you have to disable that. So there's definitely kind of a bunch of areas in the Jenkins integration that we just haven't done because we don't have time. But if anybody's willing to help out there, I mean, there's a lot of things that can make that better.
I think doing a like Jenkins 2 kind of blue ocean integration muddies the water a little bit. It's kind of like you're running pipelines within pipelines, and you've got to kind of jump between those two systems. We've already got a mechanism to call a Jenkins job regardless of where it's run, take the results from that, take the parameters, and then call another Jenkins job. We had teams migrate off of the predecessor to Blue Ocean, but Jenkins pipelines, very kind of deeply nested pipelines, and pulled that up very successfully up into Spinnaker, and that worked pretty well. So I would at least have a conversation, have a conversation around something like that happening before really committing a lot of effort to it. Is there a question?
Throw this. My arm
Best.
isn't very good.
Yeah, before you ask this question, in our space, we use Jenkins both from a CI build, and then we also use Jenkins for extensions and deployment. And I'm kind of the same way. So we're trying to get everybody to kind of surface the data that matters as an artifact out of their build jobs that do their release, that ultimately trigger Spinnaker to start deploying and do those things. So the UI parts of Jenkins for the builds are kind of boring because they have succeeded to get to that point. When it comes to the deployment side, we really encourage people just to focus on small, cohesive jobs, right? Don't build big pipelines in Jenkins. Build a job, it has an input, has a direct output, and it's a task at that point. And that's how you extend with the Jenkins stage.
Changing pace a little bit, I wanted to ask about extending Spinnaker from the plugins perspective, because it seems that right now y'all are recommending that we, from Cameron's talk yesterday, write our own libraries and take advantage of the dependency injections part of Spring Boot, and then compile our own build of the Spinnaker services. That doesn't lend itself to collaboration with the community, and it makes it a little difficult if we have something that we think would be useful for 10% of people who use Spinnaker. How do we get it out there to that 10% without having to support the 90% of people who are going to look at it and be like, why is that even in the code?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's something certainly to consider and to certainly hear proposals on what that might look like. Like, how can I make a more easily distributable extension to Spinnaker that doesn't require me to monkey with the main code base and kind of get it committed in there, but also ensure it's discoverable, make sure it's like people can package it in and enable it where appropriate. I don't have a good answer for that right now, but I can see its benefit.
From the perspective of the artifacts, you have to ask yourself, what do you want to extend Spinnaker for? And in most cases, what we see is people want to have another way to talk with the system and pass data back and forth. And if it's not something simple like a pipeline parameter, like some string value or something you can encapsulate in a Spring expression, it might be something like you want to get a file or a folder from GitHub into Spinnaker and have it do something smart with that. Or you want to produce artifacts, stage them in an S3 bucket, and then have those pulled out of S3 and used in some way in Spinnaker as pipeline parameters or as a manifest in Kubernetes. And as you start to think about these things, you realize there's really a lot of ways that you can make use of these artifacts and use them in interesting ways inside of Spinnaker. And ideally, with providing a proper API for supplying those to Spinnaker and also extracting them from Spinnaker after it finishes, Like, for example, you could say that some Spinnaker pipeline could export the things that deployed as artifacts, and then some further integration tests we could run based on the things that were deployed, because the names might not be statically resolvable. It's not the full picture solution to how do we get Spinnaker to be fully pluggable, but it gets us quite a bit further when you talk about how does it interact with any arbitrary CI system, or how do you have it talk to GitHub events and stuff like that.
Is your question about plugin, is it the style of code that you have to write or the mechanics of distribution?
Primarily about the mechanics of distribution.
Okay. Because I think that's more of a solvable problem now that you have like Halyard as the standard entry point for assembling the distribution. That's like we can start to at least think about that. But this is something, and I'm interacting as part of the panel here. I thought of this when we first did the very first release of Spinnaker. It's like, how are we going to get this to people in ways that would allow them to extend it but not have to compile it? And it's still an open problem, but now that we have a tool that will build effectively a distribution of it for you that's not compiled, there could be, all you need to do is put things on the class path and Spring will assemble it. So it doesn't, you don't necessarily have to have things compiled. So the why, everything's there to build custom things from other pieces that doesn't involve running a build like a Java build. So it's it's all possible. It's just a matter of like figuring out how would people distribute these things. It's like there's all of the ecosystem requirements around, like suddenly you want to stick something in that didn't come from the Spinnaker core distribution. So
I think that's the one concern as well. Like what's the quality of the code out there? Like if you have some sort of plugin repository where anybody can just say, oh yeah, here's my integration with X, Y, and Z, and then all of a sudden that person gets run over by a bus and nobody knows how it works. You run into this kind of quality issues as well. So, like perhaps having this notion of like more validated things that are committed into core so that at least there's a certain level of, like checking and integration scaling and all this stuff is there at this point makes more sense, but I don't know if the rest of the panel agrees with it.
The devil's advocate approach to that would be we have stuff in core right now that's not terribly well maintained. So I think that problem or you could run into the same problem either way. One of the issues with stuff going into core is then you run into a bit of a configuration nightmare where you need to understand and remember all these configuration flags of when you want stuff enabled and disabled. We see a bit of that here at Netflix because we run 3 different stacks, and each of those stacks has a different profile in our YAML files, and there's lots of inheritance going on there, so we need to kind of be worried about what's being inherited, and we don't want to inherit the wrong thing that turns something on in a pre-staging environment. So as much as you could maybe avoid that by something physically not being on the class path is an interesting idea.
Also wanted to follow up with that is, do y'all maintain a list of feature requests? I noticed the roadmap is pretty broad these days as the team, I guess, is expanding, but do you have any asks that we should, features that we should be working on that would get into core that you want the community to be contributing?
Yes. The GitHub issue tracker is pretty great too. I think if there's an issue there that you see that you want implemented and you ping, I think it's like Spinnaker/reviewers, or you just ping the dev channel and say like, what do people think about this? And people are like, yeah, we want that, but don't have time. That's a great place to jump in.
You can ping Spinnaker reviewers. So first get a job at Google or Netflix, then ping Spinnaker reviewers. But otherwise, use the dev chat.
To answer the specific question around roadmap and what the open source community can contribute, that survey that I talked about yesterday morning that I would definitely encourage everyone to fill out was eye-opening for me, and I suspect other people that have seen the results, in that a lot of the core features that you all want are the same core features that, for example, users at Netflix want. And so it was an opportunity for me to realize that we should do a better job about talking about our long-term roadmap and some of the big things we're thinking about. Because we used to look at it and say, well, this is just a Netflix problem, so it's not really worth kind of muddying the open source world with all these problems. But it turns out you all want the same thing. So the long answer is I will do a better job, along with Steve and other people in the community, of articulating these are some things we're really thinking about working on over the next few quarters, and we'd love some help.
I may be interpreting your question a little bit wrong, but it sounded like you're asking, like, if you want to start contributing, you know, you're asking, like, where would be a good place to start? And I would say that it'd be better for you if you find your pain point and contribute to fix that, because you're going to be more engaged with fixing what you already, your pain point, your passion, you know, not, oh, here's, you know, there's a bug in, you know, that Netflix has or Google has with something that I never use, and like, I can submit something for it, but I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to see it. Like, it's, you know, after that, you know, I'm just going to dump it on core and forget about it.
So we'll do one more question, and I think I have to hand it back to Andy.
I believe there is a support for Cloud Foundry in Azure and Cloud Driver, but I haven't heard much about those two providers lately. Do you guys have any insight? Are they still being actively developed?
Throw it back to him.
Let's throw it to Andy.
So yeah, there is Cloud Foundry and Azure support. Those two efforts were led by Pivotal and Microsoft. The Pivotal team has moved on some other stuff, and the Microsoft team is trying to figure out who can kind of take it over. I think this is a great opportunity for the open source community to kind of step up and add the particular features they want. But I think this is also an indication of reality for open source in that, you know, for example, the Pivotal folks, they're a business. They ultimately have to, you know, account for, let's say, you know, bodies working on open source, and they have to find some sort of source of revenue. And they saw a better source, let's say, somewhere else than they saw within Spinnaker. That doesn't mean the effort's dead. I think anyone can pick it up and actually run with it, but it's a reality of open source. You can see, obviously, that Netflix committed to AWS, and, you know, obviously Google is committed to GCP. Target's doing a lot of OpenStack stuff. And hopefully we can get Microsoft kind of squared away and figure out where their priorities lie.
Andy, can you add to that? Can
You can do it, Andy. You can do it.
I'm ready to dive. Oh, come on, man.
No, I'm going to throw it. I'm going to throw it.
Give it to me. No.
So 3 Microsoft people registered, but I don't know if they're here. Is anybody from Microsoft here? So we have a customer on Azure that's asking for Spinnaker support and saying it's a blocker if they don't get it. The Microsoft team working with them is very motivated to make them happy. They have asked us to find them other companies that want Spinnaker to work well on Azure. If your company, or if you know of companies that want that, please let me know, because we have some very motivated Microsoft people that want to hear about it. So that'd be great.
At least they're from the same company.
I guess a different question, though, is the core community willing to just pull the plug on things if no one does step up? Because obviously if it's there but not working, which will eventually happen, I see you're nodding.
Yeah.
Like in the case of Azure, there's been a bunch of kind of questions asked in the open source Slack. There's been GitHub issues. There are stuff that is not working. My personal opinion is I lean towards pulling the plug, clearly separating it, getting it out of the code base, because it does muddy the water, and leaving it somewhere else so that if somebody wants to step up and kind of support that, there's a starting point. You obviously don't need to start from scratch, but I don't think anybody, certainly on this panel, kind of has the capacity to take up a cloud provider that they're not actually running in production. And that's kind of the best way of keeping certainly cloud provider integrations up to date, is if you're running it in production and you really care about it. That's why I would say the AWS one is quite good. It's battle tested here. Similarly with Titus, Google and Kubernetes as well, OpenStack, kind of the stuff that there's people here that built it because they want to run it. That's a pattern that we've seen work really well.
I think it's worth pointing out when Adam was saying pull the plug is that this is that whole conversation about moving the repos.
Oh.
Definitely not grabbing for that one.
Come on.
This feeds into the conversation about breaking up CloudDriver into separate repos. And this is something that, yeah, so we could take, let's say, the Azure one or the Cloud Foundry one, put it in its own repo and say, hey, if you're really interested in continuing on with Cloud Foundry, there's your repo, have at it. So pulling the plug, that's how I see pulling the plug, not so much just completely removing the code and saying goodbye.
Goodbye. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So, Cerner, we kind of are in a unique position because we're a producer or supporter of one of those right now. Although I think, Will was pretty clear in his discussion the other day. It's like we're motivated to do the things that we're using as it relates to features that we're not using. And if the community is looking to run DCOS and wants those features, we're going to look to the community to help build those features. But then we're also a consumer of some of the other providers, right? And I think it would be good to, if nothing else, at least indicate kind of a maturity level for a given cloud provider implementation. Because as a consumer, you want to kind of know going in, hey, if I want to do Azure, it's not fully supported, not fully up to date. That's good to know going in.
I know one challenge we had with OpenStack is when we developed it, we were on, so I don't know how many are familiar with the OpenStack release model, but it is fast. Every 6 months, they have a conference and they do a major release. And they're not good about API compatibility. So like at Target, we were 2 versions behind the current. I believe Veritas was 1 version behind current at the time, and through the process, we got to a point where like we just could not control or we could not manage load balancers and attach server groups to them correctly through the API, and so we had to actually say, all right, we're going to target latest, but we didn't actually have an OpenStack cluster on latest, and so we got done, and then we just sat on it for a year until our OpenStack team can now finally have a cluster for us to use Spinnaker with. And so now we're getting back into, oh, hey, here's all the rough edges that we thought worked. And turns out when you actually try using it, like, not really. But now that's, again, 2 releases behind, I think. And that is going to be an ongoing challenge for us.
So do you guys feel like this is really more of a documentation issue when you can have like a page in the Spinnaker IO site that says, here are the versions that we have, like Kubernetes, does it work with latest version on Xenio, that kind of stuff? Like, do you feel like that would be helpful? Whoever's asked the question.
I can point out that we originally, as part of the release process, wanted to publish all the test results across various platforms where Spinnaker is installed and what platform Spinnaker is managing. But the first try wasn't very consumable. We're going to take another look at making that maybe easier to grok and look at and see that, well, hey, this cloud provider has some issue in the latest release.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the ideal way of doing it, in my opinion, is to have some sanity tests that run as part of a proper release that ideally runs against each of the target environments. Assuming we were able to split apart cloud provider, you could also have a bit of a TCK that runs between all the cloud provider implementations and maybe just publish the results of that. And you'd catch things that maybe fell out of date. I suspect it would definitely have caught the most recent issues with Azure. But yeah, that's easier said than done.
I know Eric at Google had a project that I think is now under the Spinnaker org, isn't it?
Yeah.
For doing sort of like live testing against
Yeah, I do.
Spinnaker?
And in fact, we caught the Azure problem when, at the moment it was introduced, and we notified Microsoft back, but they just don't have the resources to fix it. So ultimately, we agreed with them that we would take it out of, regular testing, but because, yeah, so we need to publish the, as Lars was saying, summary about what platforms are supported. Normally, we test everything, we don't release things unless everything's working to the tests provided by the different providers. So, yeah, that's something that we need to address.
The introduction of OpenStack and Kubernetes providers, which you build internally and manage internally and have different versions, and we are doing that with Kubernetes in Schibsted as well. And currently we're running 1.6. I know there will come a new cluster with 1.7, and this scares me a lot. We will probably at some point have a version 2 and also a version 1.6 cluster, and I'm kind of scared of how we should manage Spinnaker with regards to these cloud providers, which are not like updated centrally by like AVS is updated by AVS, and you can have a consistent API to play with, and yeah.
Yeah, I would be scared too. The existing client library, the one that we've been using, the way it was built, it was partially auto-generated and partially handwritten, and as a result, the various sub-resources all run at different versions with respect to the Kubernetes they target. So I think like the autoscalers target Kubernetes 1.7, and some of the resources target Kubernetes 1.6. In theory, everything is backwards compatible, but we can't make any promises. As a result of like the pain that's introduced, we're switching over to a client library that's being auto-generated by the Kubernetes client team proper. They use the open API spec. Everything's versioned. There's a versioned release matrix as a part of it. That's something that we can publish alongside Spinnaker and say that, hey, we have full support for everything in 1.7. Everything in 1.6 should still work. It's been tested against these versions, and that should improve. But as of right now, with the result of how the client library works, we can't do much better.
I know when we started doing the OpenStack, we dealt with it as well because, like I said, Veritas was on a different version than Target was, and obviously neither of our dev teams could force the operations teams in charge of OpenStack to change versions, and so we actually had to have like config options of we're on V3 or we're on V2, and I mean, luckily with OpenStack, like I said, they have a very, very aggressive release schedule, which I think is crazy for the scale of private cloud. But that also means that they're deprecating fast. So you could have, just decide like, okay, this has been end of life. We're not going to support it within Spinnaker anymore, maybe, because also enterprises aren't upgrading OpenStack as fast. So that is a very big concern. We just haven't had to deal with it yet.
All right, we are at 4. Need to hand it back over to Andy, but thank you to the panelists. Appreciate it.
And thanks for all the questions. If anybody wants to talk further, there's still a few more hours, I think. So come grab any of us.
Yeah, let's talk breakout sessions. So can I get the mic? All right, so the way the breakout session is going to work, and I've talked about this a few times. Thanks again for all the panelists. That was an awesome discussion. Thank you very much. I suspect some of you will be needed for some of these breakout sessions, I bet. So we have this room. We have the other 2 rooms we've been in all the last 2 days, Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Birdcage, thank you. And we can go outside and whatnot. So we're not limited to 3 breakout sessions. But the things I have heard, either people have come to me or I've seen notepads up, but there was an idea to do a breakout session on compliance, security, all things SOX. How many people want to do that? Okay, I see Isaac raise his hand. Isaac, where do you want to do it? Ferris?
Yeah, fair, sounds good.
I think that's track 1. Track 2?
Yes, track 1.
Track 1. So track 1, we'll have a breakout session about security and whatnot, compliance. There was another request for managed pipeline templates. Few folks, okay, I see enough hands. Actually, how about this? Let me read out the list and then we'll come back. Managed pipeline templates, Halyard, Kubernetes, run job, just future roadmap, and then operating Spinnaker. All right, that being said, do we want to do, how many people want to talk about managed pipeline templates? All right, still got hands up. I'm looking at Rob. You want to go to
Wherever you want.
track 2?
Okay.
That's Birdcage.
Cool.
Halyard.
Silence.
Okay, so F and Lars, grab a table.
Hey, Andy?
Yes, sir.
Does anyone want to sit down with me and have an in-depth conversation about CSS?
I do.
That could be exciting. Yeah.
Kubernetes. Who wants to talk Kubernetes? All right, we got some folks that want to talk Kubernetes. I'm looking at you, Lars. So you have 2 conversations you're going to have to, or if you can hand off this. Where is Duffler? Did he just leave?
Passing our motorcycles.
He fell over the face first. The stash was so heavy. Run job. This one actually had some talk on the channel. Run job, kind of the future of run job.
Yeah, Cameron had to go home apparently, so I'm figuring a hangout or something like that.
Okay. Roadmap. Okay, I'll lead the roadmap one. We can. I didn't mean to take this room. How about this? Roadmap will go outside, and then the last one was operating Spinnaker. One person. Okay, we're gonna do the roadmap one in here. Anything else people want to discuss?
Yeah, at this point, I think you just get like whoever wants to have one that wasn't listed, just shout it out.
Yeah, speak up.
Anyone interested in just
All right, some people want to see the Netflix Spinnaker. Tomas from Netflix will happily show off all the good work that the team here has done. Let me also just remind people, at 5, there is a happy hour sponsored by Google. So I know it's been a long 2 days. The amount of information that has been coming out from all of you has just been incredible. It's like a fire hose. We did record, I just dated myself. We just recorded, I think, every session, so it'll take us a few days to figure out how to, get those all up on the interwebs. But we will, this has been amazing. And so hold on for like 2 more hours or whatever. Let's get through the breakout sessions network, and then we can have a good time, thanks to Google. And I will be sending out another survey to find out how this, what you guys thought of this and what we could do better next year. But I really appreciate each and every one of you coming here for 2 whole days, and just this has been incredible. It's been overwhelming, in fact. So let's break out for those breakout sessions. Operating Spinnaker here, the roadmap here is Stephen here. Other stakeholders, please stay here. Isaac's leading the kind of SOC, security, all things compliance, auditing in track 1, and then track 2 we said was managed pipeline templates. And why don't we just throw in declarative delivery as well, and all things millennial.
Just go.
Bring your tight jeans and your facial hair and. I'm the one up here. All right, and then we'll see everyone for and then we
Where are we
Kubernetes.
Netflix at?
I'm sorry.
Where are we doing the Netflix demo at?
I can project here, and can you guys just go with it?
Great idea. So Netflix demo we'll do in the theater. Roadmap, let's go outside where we had breakfast. We can talk more about that. And then there was a Kubernetes conversation, and we're going to do that outside as well.
Andy, this has been incredible. Thank you so much. This has taken so much work to put together, and it's been a really